Topic 1. The journey of preparation, the disguised path. Let's be honest, no one likes discomfort. No one enjoys being in a season where everything feels stuck, confusing, or stripped away. But here is the deeper truth most people miss. Your pain has a purpose. When everything seems quiet, when prayers feel unanswered, when people leave and doors close, that's not evidence of abandonment. That's God's purpose in your pain unfolding. God doesn't waste suffering, He repurposes it. And often, the very thing you're begging Him to take away is the very thing He's using to prepare you. You see, God never gives weight to a structure that hasn't been tested. Just like builders don't place a roof on a foundation that hasn't cured, God does not place a calling on a character that hasn't been shaped. That delay you're facing? It's not denial, it's design. He's setting your root system. Spiritual growth doesn't come from mountaintop moments, it comes from hidden seasons, desert places, and nights where you cry yourself to sleep asking, why? But those tears, they water your soil. They make you fertile for what's coming next. Think about pruning. Any gardener knows that for a tree to bear more fruit, some branches must be cut. Not the dead ones, the ones that look healthy, but are misdirecting energy. God's pruning process is uncomfortable, but intentional. When people exit your life, when habits fall apart, when what used to work no longer does, you're not failing. You're being freed. This is how God creates space for the next thing. If you try to hold on to everything, you'll never grow into anything. Pruning feels like loss, but it's actually grace in disguise. That's why faith-based encouragement is so needed in moments like this. It reminds you that the storm is not here to destroy, it's here to cleanse. It forces the deep things to surface. It breaks up shallow roots and forces your faith to grow downward, deeper, stronger. That quiet season you hate, that hidden valley where no one's clapping, no one's noticing, no one's calling. That's where God does His best work. Hidden obedience leads to visible blessings. But only those with a Christian inspiration speech in their hearts, those who preach to themselves in the silence, will survive it. It's not easy, but it's not punishment either. You are being prepared. And the greater the assignment, the more intense the preparation. You're not cursed. You're not forgotten. You are chosen. And chosen vessels get crushed before they get filled. So if life has felt like it's falling apart, hear this. It's actually falling into place. God is removing what cannot go with you. He's stripping what would sabotage the blessing. He's forging a foundation that can carry something big. This is when the whispers of inspirational messages start to stir something inside you. Not from people, but from God Himself. He reminds you that everything you're going through now is shaping the future you prayed for. Oh, said you wanted to go higher. This is what that looks like. Preparation, pressure, and eventually promotion. But before that happens, there's a process, and it's not random, because what comes next requires you to be stronger, clearer, and bolder than ever before. Topic 2. Structure of preparation, elements and stages. God doesn't just prepare you emotionally, He structures your transformation, com sabiduria e intenção. Every part of the process has un proposito. And even when it looks like chaos, there's a divine order in motion. The first element? Tests and uncertainties. You start noticing delays, obstacles, and unexpected silence. But those aren't signs of rejection, they're invitations to trust. Every time God places you in a season of waiting, He's actually strengthening your capacity. You're not just being stalled, you're being stretched. During this phase, your patience is tested. Your faith is tested. Your identity is tested. That's how spiritual growth happens in real time. God doesn't just want your worship, He wants your trust when there's no explanation. When you stop trying to figure it all out and start obeying anyway, that's when He begins releasing strength inside you. The pain becomes purposeful. The pressure produces resilience. And suddenly, you realize you're becoming someone you barely recognize the best way possible. Then comes the second element, removals, relationship shift. People you relied on vanish. Doors you counted on slam shut. And if you're not careful, you'll call that a curse. But it's not a curse, it's calibration. God is removing what's no longer aligned with the next version of you. And here's the truth. He's not just cutting away distractions. He's creating space for your calling. That space may feel like loneliness at first, but it's not a void. It's an altar. An opening where you can finally hear His voice without the noise. And when the noise clears, something begins to awaken. This is the third phase, the inner awakening. It's subtle. You won't hear thunder, but suddenly you start feeling different. Certain things that once mattered don't anymore. You won't hear thunder, but suddenly you start feeling different. Certain things that once mattered anymore. You begin having new desires, divine discomfort, holy tension. That's God drawing you closer. It's not anxiety, it's alignment. That whisper that says there's more, that's the Holy Spirit knocking. Not to condemn you, but to call you into purpose. That's the moment when faith-based encouragement becomes personal. Because now, it's not just a message you heard, it's something you feel. Finally, there's the fourth element, the action of faith. This is where everything shifts. Not because you finally have clarity, but because you obey anyway. It's like Abraham leaving his homeland, or Peter stepping out onto the water. You don't see the full map, but you move. That one act of obedience, even when scared, even when unsure, unlocks supernatural acceleration. That's when you start experiencing those God has for you moments. Moments where the path appears after you take the first step. Because God doesn't reward clarity, He rewards faith. Each of these four elements is not just a stage, they're a spiritual cycle that repeats every time you're being elevated. And if you can recognize where you are, you stop resisting and start cooperating with the process. Because next, we're going to look at the stories of people who went through each of these phases and came out the other side, carrying something greater than they imagined. Topic 3. Stories to inspire. Sometimes the best way to understand God's preparation is through the lives of those He prepared before us. Take David, for example. Anointed king as a boy, but spent years running from a man he would one day replace. He wasn't crowned immediately. He was chased, hiding in caves, betrayed, misunderstood. But during those dark, lonely days, God wasn't punishing David. He was forming him. That's faith during hard times in its rawest form, trusting the promise when all you see is pain. And what about Joseph? He had a dream as a teenager, but before the dream came true, he was sold by his brothers, thrown into a pit, falsely accused, and forgotten in prison. That's not how victory usually looks, but that's the route God used. Why? Because the palace requires a man who's been tested in the prison. You can't lead with power unless you've served in obscurity. That's God's purpose in your painto, teach you humility, patience, and mercy before you're handed influence. Every person we admire in Scripture faced a hidden valley before public elevation. Why? Because the desert purifies. The pit produces perspective. The delay births depth. God knows that a blessing given too soon can become a burden. That's why the most powerful Christian motivational speeches don't come from those who avoided the storm, but from those who walked through it with worship still in their mouth. Their obedience didn't make life easy, but it made their calling real. David didn't learn leadership in a palace, he learned it in the wild. Joseph didn't learn strategy at the top, learned it at the bottom. They both had to be isolated before they could be elevated. And the same may be true for you. If you feel hidden, forgotten, left behind, it might be your proving ground. Not a setback. A setup. A divine delay that's making you ready for a release that's bigger than you imagined. That's how God works. Quietly, faithfully, perfectly. And the beautiful thing? These aren't just old stories. They're patterns, templates, models of how spiritual growth really works. Not through shortcuts, but through surrender. Not through control, but through character. And once you start to see your struggle mirrored in their journey, everything changes. You stop complaining about the waiting season, and you start preparing. Because what's coming next will require the version of you that only pain could produce. Topic 4. Refine strategic mindset. There comes a moment in every spiritual journey when your mindset has to evolve, or you'll stay stuck in cycles of fear and frustration. This is where reframing becomes a spiritual weapon. You stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and start asking, "What is God building in me?" That shift alone changes everything. It turns storms into schoolrooms. It transforms wounds into wisdom. That's how you begin to access faith-based encouragement from within, not just to feel better, but to rise stronger. Then, something deeper starts happening. Your priorities change. What once gave you identity, approval, applause, control starts to lose its grip. Instead, you begin to crave things that align with your calling. Peace becomes more valuable than being right. Obedience becomes more important than comfort. That's when spiritual growth matures. You start choosing silence over noise, prayer over panic, and purpose over popularity. And just like that, you realize you've been pruned not just on the outside, but in your thinking. This is where obedience without clarity becomes your new normal. Like Abraham leaving everything he knew, or Peter stepping out onto waves with no guarantees. You move not because you know the whole planet, because you trust the planner. That's the difference between emotional faith and strategic faith. Emotional faith says, "It'll go when I feel it." Strategic faith says, "It'll go because he said it." That's the root of every real Christian motivational speech, not hype, but holy surrender. You walk not by sight, but by trust. And when you begin thinking this way, seeing trial as training and silence as strategy, you step into a rare level of spiritual power. You're no longer thrown off by delays. You don't panic in pruning seasons, because now you know the pattern. You know God has for you something that requires a deeper, refined version of you. And just when you settle into that new awareness, comes the moment to apply everything with clarity, with the formulas and cycles that structure this spiritual process. Topic 5. Formulas and diagrams. Let's break down what's really happening during your season of waiting. Because God is not random, He works in patterns. The first pattern is what I call the cycle of preparation. It begins with adversity. Pain shows up. People leave. Doors close. That's not punishment, it's purification. Then comes the silence. God starts removing distractions. That's where most people panic. But if you wait long enough, the next phase arrives, inner awakening. That gentle whisper, that holy restlessness, that's when you start feeling what God has for you in your spirit, before it shows up in your reality. Then comes the shift, the action of faith. You move, you obey. You don't need a full answer, you just need a clear next step. That one act of obedience breaks the cycle and activates the release. Because in this divine structure, obedience is not the reward, it's the key. And when God sees faith in motion, He responds with acceleration. That's why this process isn't just emotional, it's spiritual engineering. It's a blueprint. And once you understand it, you stop resisting the cycle and start cooperating with it. There's also a simple but powerful formula. Obedience plus action equals divine signal plus blessing. Let's unpack that. Obedience means trusting when it doesn't make sense. Action means doing something that aligns with that trust. When both meet, heaven responds. You attract favor you didn't chase. Doors open that you couldn't force. That's not coincidence, that's spiritual cause and effect. That's why this isn't just a faith motivational video, it's a roadmap. One you can follow again and again, every time you're being prepared for the next level. And if you've been in that cycle lately, it's time to take the next step. Topic 6. Action Plan 5 Pragmatic Steps. Now that you've seen the process, It's time to walk it out. God never reveals patterns just to inspire you. He reveals them so you can respond. That's where this faith-based encouragement turns into transformation. First step, reflect on your desert. Ask yourself, what's been pressing on me lately? What doors have closed? What relationships have shifted? Because your current adversity often holds clues to what God is preparing you for. Don't dismiss the discomfort it's speaking. Step 2. Identify what's being pruned. Take inventory. Are there habits that suddenly feel heavy? People who once felt aligned, but now create confusion? Sometimes God removes before He reveals. And pruning doesn't always look like failure, it often feels like a release. The people who left weren't a loss, they were a lesson. That mindset is what turns trials into tools. That's where spiritual growth begins, not just in what you do, but in how you interpret what God is doing. Sometimes God removes before He reveals. And pruning doesn't always look like failure, it often feels like a release. The people who left weren't a loss, they were a lesson. That mindset is what turns trials into tools. That's where spiritual growth begins, not just in what you do, but in how you interpret what God is doing. Step 3 is about listening to your inner awakenings. Pay attention to subtle shifts in desire, dreams, or discomfort. Are there recurring thoughts, ideas you've been ignoring? Random confirmations that won't leave you alone? Those are divine nudges. Write them down. Pray over them. Meditate in silence. Because prayer motivation doesn't always start with words, it often starts with attention. Step 4 is where the shift begins. Take one step of faith today, not a leap. Just one step that aligns with obedience. A message sent. A decision made. A door knocked on. That movement matters. And finally, step 5, record your obedience. Not for perfection but for perspective. Keep a journal of how God responds to your faith. You'll be shocked at how fast things shift once you align with His rhythm. And the more you track it, the more you'll trust it. That's how trusting God in hard times becomes second nature, because life gets easier, but because your obedience gets stronger. And when your obedience becomes consistent, something amazing happens in your spirit. Let's talk about what that looks like next. Topic 7. Real impact. What changes? So what actually changes when you walk through all of this, when you endure the pruning, obey without clarity, and move with faith? First, your life gains clarity. Not necessarily in the form of answered questions, but in the alignment of your soul. You start living on purpose. The fog lifts. You no longer chase what's not for you. You begin to discern what God has for you, and what simply isn't yours to carry anymore. And that clarity becomes peace. Then comes confidence, not in yourself alone, but in the one who called you. You begin to move with a quiet boldness. The kind that doesn't need to announce itself. Why? Because you've seen what God can do with brokenness. You've seen how every setback was a setup. You stop fearing detours, because you now understand they're divine. That's not just emotional strength, it's spiritual growth. That's the kind of confidence that walks into rooms silently knowing, "I've been prepared for this." But maybe the most powerful shift is this. Your faith comes alive, not as theory, but as a lifestyle. You begin to see prayer not just as a request, but as a strategy. You trust in hard times because you've learned the storm is part of the story. That's when your life becomes a message. You start carrying a presence. Your words carry weight. And suddenly, you become the kind of person who doesn't just survive the storm, you help others navigate theirs. That's the mark of someone who has walked through fire and come out refined. And as you stand in that place of transformation, you'll begin to feel it. The assignment is near. The next door is forming. And now you're ready. Ready to carry the responsibility. Ready to steward the blessing. Ready to be trusted. Because now you know the pattern. And when you know the pattern, you know how to walk with God through every new level. So now you know, when God is about to give you something big, He doesn't just hand it to you. He prepares you. He stretches you. He refines you. He removes what you can no longer carry. He whispers when you expect a shout. And through every season, painful, silent, uncertain, He is making you ready. This isn't punishment. This is the purpose. This is the signature of God. Transformation through tension. Clarity through confusion. Strength through surrender. Now I want you to pause and ask yourself, which stage are you in right now? Are you in the storm? The pruning? The silence? The awakening? Are you wrestling with a delayed promise or carrying a new one? Drop it in the comments. Let me know which part of this message hit you hardest. Because your voice matters. And your testimony is forming even if it doesn't look like it yet. I read every message. And I want to walk with you as you walk with God. And if this word stirred your spirit, don't just leave inspired. Leave committed. Subscribe now. Hit that bell. Share this video with someone who's walking through fire. This channel is more than motivational videos. It's a place for faith-based encouragement, for spiritual clarity, for those rising into the future God has for them. We're just getting started. And trust me, you don't want to miss what He's about to do in your life next.